She was sitting in her lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning when everything changed. Not because of what her lawyer told her, but because of what he showed her. A single document. One piece of paper that made her entire life make sense in the worst possible way. She read the letterhead. She read the date. She read the signature at the bottom, and it was his signature, his name, his trust, his control. She felt her chest tighten. She felt her hands shake. And in that moment, she understood that she had spent the last 23 years of her life building something that was never, ever hers. She had been running a company worth $400 million, making decisions that affected thousands of employees, winning awards, appearing on magazine covers, being celebrated as a self-made woman who had clawed her way to the top. But none of it was real. None of it belonged to her. Every single piece of it belonged to him. And he had let her believe she was winning while he was actually in complete control the entire time. Her name was Rebecca Mitchell. She was 49 years old. She lived in Chicago. She was the chief executive officer of Richardson Industries, a company that had started as a small real estate firm in the 1970s and had grown, under her leadership, into a massive conglomerate that owned commercial properties, operated technology divisions, and managed investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. On the surface, her life looked perfect. She had a corner office on the 42nd floor of a downtown high-rise with windows that looked out over Lake Michigan. She had a salary that exceeded $2 million a year. She had business cards that read her name and her title. She had the respect of her board of directors. She had been profiled in Forbes magazine. She had given keynote speeches at business conferences. She had everything a woman could want. Everything except ownership. Everything except control. Everything except the knowledge that what she thought was hers actually belonged to someone else. And that someone else was her husband. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something. This is not a simple story about a bad marriage. This is not just a story about a controlling husband. This is a story about a legal trap so carefully constructed, so deliberately hidden, that Rebecca walked into it and didn't realize she was trapped until 23 years had passed. This is a story about how ambition can be weaponized, how trust can be weaponized, how the documents we sign without fully understanding them can be weaponized. This is a story about a man named Marcus Mitchell, who came from old money, who understood financial structures and legal entities in a way that Rebecca never did, and who used that knowledge to create a situation where his wife would appear to be a self-made success, while remaining completely dependent on him for everything. When Rebecca finally discovered the truth, she had to go to federal court to prove what everyone assumed was hers. She had to prove that she had actually built something, even though she didn't own it. She had to prove that she deserved compensation for work that had made someone else incredibly wealthy. And in doing so, she uncovered something even darker, something that would eventually land her husband in federal prison. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. So let me ask you 3 questions, and I want you to think about them as we tell this story. First question, how did a woman with no family money, no connections, no inheritance, become the chief executive officer of a company worth $400 million? Second question, why did her marriage fall apart the exact moment she reached the top? And third, the most important question, who actually owned the company that she thought she had built? These are the questions that Rebecca was asking herself when she finally hired lawyers and started investigating her own life. These are the questions that will drive us through this story, because the answers to these questions are where everything becomes clear. The answers show us how a trap was built, how it was hidden, how it was maintained, how a person could be at the very top of an organization, making all the decisions, earning all the accolades, and still have absolutely no legal claim to anything. This is one of the most complicated stories we have ever covered, because it involves trust and deception and legal structures and family dynamics and ambition and fear and ultimately, a woman who had to decide whether she was going to accept the life that had been built for her or whether she was going to fight for the truth. Rebecca grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a middle-class suburb. Her father worked as a manager at a manufacturing facility. Her mother was a school teacher. They were good people. They were not wealthy. They did not have connections in the business world. They could not open doors for their daughter. What they gave her instead was something different. They gave her ambition. They gave her work ethic. They gave her the belief that she could achieve anything if she worked hard enough. Rebecca was the kind of child who set goals and then methodically pursued them. When she was 10 years old, she decided she wanted to be successful in business. When she was 15, she decided she wanted to go to a good college. She worked part-time jobs through high school. She maintained straight A's. She earned scholarships. By the time she was 18, she was attending Ohio State University on a combination of academic scholarships and her own savings from working retail and tutoring. She majored in business administration. She minored in economics. She joined clubs. She made connections. She did internships. She was the kind of student who understood that education was a tool and that you had to use every tool available to you. When she graduated at 22 years old, she had job offers from 3 different companies. She chose to work for a mid-sized real estate development firm based in Chicago. She took a job as a junior analyst. She was making $35,000 a year. She was thrilled. She had escaped Ohio. She was building the life she had always dreamed about. For the first 3 years at the company, Rebecca did what ambitious people do. She worked longer hours than everyone else. She took on projects that nobody else wanted. She learned the business from every angle. She proved that she could be trusted with responsibility. She moved up from junior analyst to senior analyst. Her salary increased to $55,000. She was living in a small apartment in Chicago. She was saving money. She was reading business books. She was attending seminars. She was positioning herself for the next level. When she was 25 years old, the company promoted her to project manager. She was now overseeing teams of people. She was making $80,000 a year. She was respected. She was beginning to build a reputation as someone who was competent and driven and willing to do the work necessary to succeed. 3 years later, at 28 years old, she was promoted again, this time to the regional manager. Now she was overseeing not just a team, but multiple projects across different regions. Her salary jumped to $120,000 a year. She was on her way. She could see it clearly. She was climbing the ladder. The trajectory was perfect. Every 2 to 3 years, another promotion. Every promotion, more responsibility. Every promotion, more money. Every promotion, she was getting closer to the top. She had no doubt that one day she would run this company. She just did not know how that would happen. She did not know what role another person would play in that journey. In 1999, at a charity gala in Chicago, Rebecca met a man named Marcus Mitchell. He was 35 years old. He was handsome in the way that old money often is, understated and confident. He was wearing an expensive suit that fit perfectly. He was at the gala with his mother, who was a wealthy widow whose husband had died 10 years earlier. Marcus's father had founded an investment firm in the 1970s. That firm had made the family very wealthy. When his father died, his estate had been divided between Marcus and his younger brother, Michael. Marcus had received approximately $2 million in cash and various investment accounts. Michael had received the same. They also inherited the family business, which they now ran together. Marcus was charming. He was educated. He had gone to Northwestern University and studied finance. He understood money in a way that Rebecca understood work. He understood systems. He understood structures. When he spoke to Rebecca at the gala, he was interested in her, genuinely interested. He asked about her work. He listened to her answers. He asked follow-up questions. He seemed to genuinely care about what she was telling him. By the end of the night, he had asked for her phone number. She gave it to him. She was excited but also hesitant. Men with money, in her experience, did not pursue women like her. Women from middle-class backgrounds. Women who had to work for everything. But Marcus seemed different. He called her 3 days later. They went to dinner. Then they went to another dinner. Then they went to a movie. Then they started spending weekends together. Within 6 months, they were in a serious relationship. Within 1 year, he proposed. They were married in the summer of 2000. The wedding was large and expensive. It took place at the Chicago Athletic Association. Rebecca's parents came. Marcus's mother came. Marcus's brother came with his wife. There were 250 guests. It was the kind of wedding that Rebecca had never imagined she would have. It was beautiful, and it was perfect. And Rebecca believed, on that day, that she had found someone who understood her, someone who would support her ambitions, someone who shared her values around work and success. What she did not understand, and what she would not understand for many years, was that Marcus had his own agenda. On the surface, it looked like he was supporting her ambitions. But in reality, he was constructing something. He was building a framework. He was creating a structure that would allow him to maintain control while giving her the appearance of success. And it started with a conversation that took place about 3 months into their marriage. Marcus came home one evening and told Rebecca that he wanted to talk about their financial future. They sat down in the living room of their condominium. He had brought papers with him. He told her that he had been thinking about how they could build wealth together. He said that the real estate development company she worked for was a good company, but it was not going to make her rich. He said that he had a plan. He wanted to help her buy into the company. He wanted to structure it in a way that would protect them and their future children. He wanted to use his knowledge of financial structures to create a legal framework that would ensure their security. He explained it to her in simple terms. He said that they would create a holding company. They would use his investment income to fund the acquisition of shares in the development company. They would structure it using trusts and legal entities so that their personal assets would be protected from liability. It sounded intelligent. It sounded safe. It sounded like something that a smart husband would do for a smart wife who had big ambitions. Rebecca agreed to it. She signed whatever papers he put in front of her. She did not read them carefully. She did not have a lawyer review them. She trusted him. Why would she not trust him? He was her husband. He said he was doing this to protect her. He said he was doing this to help her. At the time, there was no reason for her to doubt that. What Marcus was actually doing was constructing what would later be discovered to be a legal trap. Here is how it worked. He created a holding company. This holding company was registered in his name and his mother's name. They were listed as the owners. Then he used the holding company to purchase shares in Richardson Industries, the development company that Rebecca worked for. He structured it so that the shares were held in a trust. The trust was controlled by Marcus. He was the trustee. This meant that technically, the shares were not owned by any individual person. They were held in trust, and Marcus controlled how the trust was managed and what happened to the income generated by those shares. Then he had Rebecca sign documents that gave her what appeared to be a stake in the company. They looked like stock options. They looked like they could eventually be converted into ownership, but there was fine print. There was language in those documents that said the options could only be exercised under certain conditions, and those conditions were controlled by Marcus. If Rebecca left the company, the options would expire. If Rebecca tried to divorce him, the options would be worthless. If Rebecca questioned his authority, he could simply refuse to allow her to exercise the options. On the surface, it looked like Marcus was helping her build wealth. In reality, he was creating a situation where she would be completely dependent on him, where she would appear to have ownership, but actually own nothing, where she would think she was climbing towards success, but she would actually be climbing at his direction and under his control. For the next 15 years, Rebecca continued to climb the ladder at Richardson Industries. She had no idea about the details of the financial structure that Marcus had created. She trusted him to handle that. She focused on her job. She focused on becoming a better executive. She worked her way from regional manager to vice president. Her salary increased to $300,000 a year. She had bonuses. She had benefits. She had stock options that she believed would eventually make her wealthy. She was respected in the company. She was respected in the industry. She began to be asked to speak at conferences. She appeared on a panel about women in business. She was interviewed by the Chicago Tribune about her journey from a middle-class background to a position of significant corporate authority. In one interview, she said something that, looking back, shows just how deceived she was. She said, "I am so grateful to my husband for supporting my career. He has created the structure that allows me to do this work. He manages our finances so that I can focus on being the best executive I can be." She meant it. She was grateful. She believed he was helping her. What she did not understand was that every aspect of her career, every achievement, every success, was happening within a framework that he controlled. Every major decision she made at work, he had somehow positioned himself to have input on. Every significant deal the company made, he had somehow structured it so that it benefited him financially. Every step up the ladder that she took, he had somehow made sure that the monetary benefits flowed to accounts that he controlled. In 2015, Rebecca was promoted to Chief Operating Officer. She was now the second most powerful person at the company. Only the CEO was above her. Her salary jumped to $750,000 a year. She was 44 years old. She had been married to Marcus for 15 years. They had 2 children. Their oldest child, Daniel, was 13. Their youngest child, Margaret, was 10. She had achieved everything she had set out to achieve. She was at the top of the corporate world. She was respected, she was successful, and yet something had begun to feel wrong. She could not put her finger on it exactly, but there was something about her marriage that felt off. Marcus had always been controlling about money. But now that she was earning a significant income of her own, she began to notice that he was controlling about everything. He questioned her business decisions. He asked her detailed questions about her meetings. He suggested changes to her strategy. And the most confusing part was that he seemed to know things about her company that he should not have known. He would mention conversations that she had had with board members. He would reference emails that he had no business reading. When she asked him how he knew these things, he would say that people had told him, or that she had mentioned it, or that he had seen it somewhere. But increasingly, Rebecca did not believe him. She began to realize that somehow, Marcus had access to information about her company that he should not have. She began to wonder if he had hired someone to spy on her. She began to wonder if he had somehow hacked into her emails. She began to wonder if the woman who sat next to her in board meetings was actually reporting directly to him. These were paranoid thoughts, or so she told herself. But paranoia is only paranoia if your fears are unfounded. In 2016, something happened that changed everything. Rebecca was working late one evening. She was alone in her office. Her computer was still on. She had stepped out to get coffee. When she came back, she noticed that Marcus's email account was open on her computer. She did not remember opening it. She asked Marcus about it the next day. He said he had sent her an email and had used her computer to check his own email to see if she had read it yet. It was a reasonable explanation. Except it was not true. She had checked her email history. He had not sent her any emails. She had checked the browser history. He had accessed his email multiple times over the course of several weeks while she was not in the office. He was accessing her computer regularly. He was checking her emails. He was reading her work communications. When she confronted him about this, he got angry. He said she was being paranoid and suspicious. He said that a good marriage was based on trust, and her lack of trust in him was hurtful. He said that he had only been checking her email to see if there was anything urgent that he needed to know about, in case he needed to help her. It was a classic manipulation. Instead of explaining why he had been accessing her private emails, he turned it around on her. He made her feel like she was the problem. She was the one who was being unreasonable. She was the one who did not trust her husband. She was the one who was breaking down the intimacy of their marriage. Rebecca apologized. She did not apologize because she believed she was wrong. She apologized because she was tired of fighting. She apologized because she was confused about what was reasonable and what was not reasonable. She apologized because she had been trained, over 15 years of marriage, to doubt her own instincts and to trust his explanations of reality. By 2017, Rebecca was no longer happy in her marriage. The joy had drained out of it. The partnership she thought she had felt like a hierarchy. She felt like she was always being questioned. She felt like she was always being scrutinized. She felt like she was never doing anything well enough. When she came home with good news about work, Marcus would immediately find the flaw in her decision. When she was excited about a promotion, Marcus would mention something she could have done better. When she received recognition for an achievement, Marcus would point out that the achievement was only possible because of the financial structure he had created. He was always there, in the background, reminding her that he was the reason she was successful. He was the reason she was secure. He was the reason she was safe. After 15 years of this, Rebecca was exhausted. She started thinking about divorce. She did not mention this to anyone, not to her friends, not to her colleagues, not to her family. But internally, she was preparing for it. She was thinking about what it would mean. She was thinking about what would happen to the children. She was thinking about what would happen to the money. She was thinking about what would happen to her career. She was thinking about the shame of another failed marriage in her extended family. Her parents had been married for 50 years. Her maternal grandparents had been married for 63 years. The idea of divorce felt like a failure, but the idea of spending the rest of her life with Marcus felt worse. In 2018, Rebecca was promoted to Chief Executive Officer. She was now running the entire company. At 47 years old, she had achieved what she had set out to achieve all those years ago, when she was a child in Ohio, with nothing but ambition and determination. She was the CEO of a major corporation. Her salary was now $1.2 million a year, not including bonuses. Her stock options were worth millions. On paper, she was a self-made woman. In reality, she was sitting on top of an empire that did not belong to her, and Marcus had never been more controlling. He wanted to know everything. How much did she make this quarter? What were the projections for next quarter? Who were the major shareholders? What were their concerns? What decisions was she planning to make? What deals was the company pursuing? It was as if he believed that her success at work was directly his success, which, in a way, it was. Because the more the company made, the more his investments in the company were worth. The more successful she was, the more valuable his trust became. She was making him wealthier while she remained dependent on him for her own sense of security. In the spring of 2018, Rebecca made a decision that she had been thinking about for more than a year. She was going to divorce Marcus. She was going to do it quietly and carefully. She was going to protect her children. She was going to hire the best lawyers she could find. And she was going to take control of her own life, finally, for the first time in 18 years. Rebecca hired a divorce lawyer named Margaret Chen. Margaret was in her 50s and had handled hundreds of divorce cases, many of them involving complex financial situations. Rebecca met with Margaret in her office and told her everything. She told her about the marriage. She told her about Marcus's controlling behavior. She told her about the financial structures he had set up. Margaret listened carefully. When Rebecca finished, Margaret said something that made Rebecca feel cold. She said, "I need to see all the documents that Marcus has created. Before we file for divorce, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Rebecca said that she did not have copies of all the documents. She said that Marcus had set everything up, and that she trusted him to have done it correctly. Margaret's expression changed. She leaned forward and said, "Rebecca, you need to understand something. In divorce cases involving complex financial structures, it is very common for one spouse to have set things up in a way that disadvantages the other spouse. I cannot tell you that is what happened here without seeing the documents, but I can tell you that if there is even a chance that Marcus has structured things in a way that protects his assets and exposes yours, we need to know that before you file for divorce." That evening, Rebecca asked Marcus if she could see all the documents related to the company. She told him that her lawyer wanted to review them for the divorce. She told him that they needed to understand what they were dividing. Marcus became angry. He said that the documents were complicated and that she would not understand them. He said that it was better if he and his lawyer handled all of that. He said that she should focus on being a good mother to their children and let him manage the legal issues. Rebecca pushed back. She said that these were her documents too. She had a right to see them. She said that if they were getting divorced, she needed to understand what she had and what she did not have. Marcus finally, reluctantly, agreed to have his lawyer send copies of the documents to her lawyer. But he made it clear that he was not happy about it. Margaret Chen took 3 weeks to review all of the documents. She requested meetings with accountants and financial analysts to help her understand the structure. When Rebecca returned to her office for the next consultation, Margaret's expression was grave. She sat Rebecca down and said, "Rebecca, I need to tell you something, and I need you to be prepared for this to be difficult to hear." Rebecca's heart started racing. She knew something was wrong. Margaret explained the structure in detail. She explained how Marcus had created holding companies. She explained how he had set up trusts. She explained how he had positioned himself as the trustee of those trusts, which gave him complete control over how the assets in the trusts were used. She explained how the shares in Richardson Industries were held in these trusts, not in Rebecca's name. She explained how the stock options that Rebecca thought she owned were actually subject to conditions that Marcus controlled. She explained how the real estate that Rebecca assumed was jointly owned was actually titled in the name of entities that Marcus controlled. When Margaret finished, she said, "Rebecca, according to these documents, you own none of this. You are an employee of the company, a highly paid employee, yes, but an employee nonetheless. The company, the real estate, the investments, the assets, they are all controlled by Marcus through these trust structures. Legally speaking, you have no claim to any of it. Rebecca felt the room start to spin. She felt like she could not breathe. She said, "That cannot be right. I built that company. I made it what it is. I am the CEO." Margaret looked at her with compassion and said, "I know, and we will argue exactly that. But first, I need to explain what we are up against." The structure that Marcus had created was perfectly legal. There was nothing illegal about it. Every trust had been created by a legitimate attorney. Every entity had been registered correctly with the state. Every document had been signed and filed properly. The problem was not that it was illegal. The problem was that it was designed to accomplish exactly what it had accomplished. It was designed to give Rebecca the appearance of ownership while giving Marcus the actual ownership. It was designed to make Rebecca believe that she was building something while ensuring that she never actually owned anything. Margaret explained how it worked. The holding company that Marcus and his mother had created had purchased shares in Richardson Industries. Those shares were worth hundreds of millions of dollars by the time Rebecca became CEO. But they were held in a trust, not owned outright. Marcus was the trustee. This meant that Marcus controlled how the shares were voted. Marcus controlled how the dividends from the shares were distributed. Marcus controlled whether the shares could be sold. Marcus controlled everything. Rebecca's stock options were separate from the shares held in the trust. They had been granted to her as part of her compensation package. But the documents granting those options included what was known as a change of control provision. This meant that if Rebecca's marital status changed, or if she left the company, or if she tried to transfer the options to anyone else, the options would become worthless. Essentially, Marcus had structured her compensation in a way that made it impossible for her to ever truly own anything without his consent. It was a trap. It was a legal trap that had been set 20 years ago and that she was only just realizing she was caught in. Rebecca filed for divorce in the spring of 2018. She filed in Illinois, which is a community property state. This meant that theoretically, anything that had been acquired during the marriage was supposed to be divided equally between the spouses. But Marcus's lawyers argued that the shares held in the trust had been purchased before the marriage. They argued that they were therefore not marital property. They argued that the trust itself predated the marriage, and therefore the assets in the trust were not subject to division. Rebecca's lawyers argued back. They said that even if the original shares had been purchased before the marriage, the growth in the value of those shares had occurred during the marriage, while Rebecca was working. They said that her labor had created that value. They said that they had documentation showing that the company's growth was directly correlated with Rebecca's work as an executive. They said that she deserved compensation for that. The case went to court. The judge listened to arguments from both sides. The judge reviewed the documents. The judge heard testimony from Rebecca and from Marcus and from various financial experts. And then the judge issued a ruling. The judge said that based on the way the assets were structured and based on the fact that the trust predated the marriage, the assets in the trust were not marital property. The judge said that Rebecca was entitled to her salary and her benefits and any bonuses that had been earned during the marriage. But the judge said that Rebecca had no claim to the company itself or to the assets held in the trust. The ruling was a devastation to Rebecca. She had built that company. She had grown it from a mid-sized regional real estate firm into a major corporation, and legally, she had no claim to any of it. Margaret Chen was not satisfied with this ruling. She appealed the decision. The appeal was based on a different argument. It was not based on the idea that Rebecca owned the company. It was based on the idea that Marcus had engaged in what was called a breach of fiduciary duty. The argument was that Marcus, in his role as a board member and as a controlling shareholder, had a duty to act in the best interests of the company and of all of its stakeholders. The argument was that instead, Marcus had used his position to benefit himself, to the detriment of other stakeholders, including his wife. The argument was that he had structured things in a way that enriched himself while keeping his wife dependent on him. The argument was that this breach of fiduciary duty created a claim against him, and Rebecca was entitled to compensation for the harm that had been caused. The appeals court reviewed the case. It took several months. During this time, Rebecca continued to work as the CEO of the company, but the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The board members knew about the divorce. The company's employees knew about it. Her children knew about it. Everyone knew that she was fighting for something that felt like it should be hers, and that Marcus was fighting to keep it all. It was humiliating, and it was exhausting. When the appeals court finally ruled, it was a partial victory. The court agreed that Marcus might have breached his fiduciary duty. The court said that the case should go back to a trial court, where a jury could hear evidence about whether Marcus had actually breached his duty, and if so, what compensation Rebecca was entitled to. Once the case was back in trial court, something called the discovery process began. This is the part of litigation where each side has the right to demand documents from the other side. Margaret Chen issued what is called a subpoena. She demanded that Marcus produce all documents related to the company, all documents related to the trusts, and all documents related to his financial dealings with the company. Marcus's lawyers protested. They said that many of these documents were privileged, meaning they were protected by attorney-client confidentiality. They said that producing them would violate Marcus's privacy. The judge disagreed. The judge said that Rebecca had a right to understand the financial structures that affected her claim, and that Marcus had to produce the documents. Slowly, the documents started arriving at Margaret's office. Boxes and boxes of documents, thousands of pages, emails, contracts, financial statements, trust agreements, corporate bylaws, board minutes. The accountants that Margaret had hired started going through all of this material. What they found was shocking. They found evidence that Marcus had been extracting value from the company in ways that went beyond what was documented in the original trust agreement. They found evidence of unusual payments to family members who did not appear to be doing work for the company. They found evidence of real estate deals that seemed to benefit Marcus personally, but that were being paid for with company money. They found evidence of consulting contracts that appeared to be fake. They found evidence of what looked like money laundering. As the accountants dug deeper, they uncovered more and more evidence of financial impropriety. Marcus had set up a company called Mitchell Enterprises. This company was owned by Marcus and his brother Michael. The company had a consulting contract with Richardson Industries. The contract was worth millions of dollars, but there was no documentation of what services Mitchell Enterprises was actually providing. There were no project plans. There were no deliverables. There was just money flowing from Richardson Industries to Mitchell Enterprises. Another discovery was that Marcus had used Richardson Industries' money to purchase a vacation home in Costa Rica. The home was titled in the name of a trust controlled by Marcus, but the company had paid for the purchase and the company paid for the maintenance and upkeep. This meant that Marcus was essentially getting the company to pay for his personal property. Another discovery was that Marcus had created what looked like a consulting position for his mother. His mother was receiving $250,000 a year from Richardson Industries, but she was not working. She was retired. She was living in Florida. There was no documentation of what she was supposed to be consulting on. Rebecca's accountants presented all of this evidence to Margaret Chen. Margaret's face was grim when she reviewed it. She said, "Rebecca, this is bigger than a divorce case now. This looks like fraud. This looks like embezzlement. This looks like criminal activity." Margaret advised Rebecca that they should report these findings to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Rebecca was reluctant at first. She did not want to be the one who put her husband in prison. She did not want to be seen as vindictive. But Margaret pointed out that this was not about revenge. This was about the truth. This was about whether criminal activity had been occurring. If it had, then it needed to be reported. Rebecca agreed. Margaret filed a report with the FBI. Within weeks, agents showed up at Rebecca's house. They showed up at her office. They started conducting interviews with board members and employees. They started demanding documents. They started subpoenaing bank records. Marcus's life began to unravel. His brother Michael, in an attempt to protect himself, agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Michael said that he had suspected that Marcus was not being entirely honest about the financial structure of the company. He said that he had raised concerns with Marcus about some of the payments being made, but had assured him that everything was legal. Michael provided the investigators with even more documentation. Michael provided them with emails in which Marcus discussed how to structure things so that they would look legitimate while actually benefiting him personally. Michael provided them with evidence that Marcus had specifically designed the trust structure to prevent Rebecca from ever gaining control of company assets. 6 months after the FBI investigation began, Marcus was charged with multiple federal crimes. He was charged with wire fraud. He was charged with securities fraud. He was charged with tax evasion. He was charged with money laundering. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. The charges were serious. If he was convicted on all counts, he could face decades in prison. Marcus's lawyers immediately began negotiating with the federal prosecutors. They offered a plea deal. They offered to have Marcus admit to some of the charges in exchange for the government agreeing not to pursue others. But the prosecutors were not interested in a deal. They had too much evidence. They had testimony from Michael. They had thousands of documents. They had financial records. They had emails. The case was too strong. The prosecutors told Marcus's lawyers that they intended to prosecute this case to the fullest extent of the law. Rebecca was called to testify before a grand jury. She told the grand jury about her marriage. She told them about discovering that she did not own the company. She told them about the way Marcus had controlled her through financial structures instead of violence. She told them about the time she had found his email open on her computer. She told them about how he had gaslit her when she confronted him about it. She told them about how she had felt trapped and confused and unable to trust her own perceptions of reality. The grand jury indicted Marcus on all counts. The trial began in the fall of 2019. It lasted for 6 weeks. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They called accountants to testify about the financial structures. They called employees from the company to testify about unusual payments they had been instructed to make. They called the company's CFO to testify about pressure he had felt from Marcus to approve questionable transactions. They called Rebecca to the stand. She testified about her understanding of the company's ownership structure. She testified about what Marcus had told her regarding the trusts. She testified about her assumption that she was building something that would eventually be hers. She testified about the moment when she realized that assumption had been wrong. The prosecutors played emails that Marcus had written. The emails were damning. In one email, Marcus wrote to Michael, "We need to make sure Rebecca never understands how much money is flowing through these entities. She needs to believe that Marcus has set everything up to protect her, when really we have set everything up to ensure that she will never have control of anything." In another email, Marcus wrote, "The beauty of this structure is that she will appear to be successful. She will be celebrated as a self-made woman, and the entire time, every dollar she generates will flow to us. She will work herself to exhaustion, and in the end, she will own nothing." End quote. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they came back into the courtroom, the verdict was guilty on all counts. The judge immediately ordered that Marcus be taken into custody. Marcus was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom. Rebecca watched him go. She did not feel triumphant. She felt sad. She had spent 18 years with this man. They had 2 children together. They had built a life together, or so she thought. And in the end, he had been willing to commit federal crimes in order to maintain control over her. The judge scheduled a sentencing hearing for 3 months later. At the sentencing, Rebecca was given the opportunity to make a statement. She stood up in the courtroom, in front of the judge and jury and media. She said, "Marcus Mitchell was not my husband. He was a person who created an elaborate illusion of a marriage. He made me believe that he was supporting my ambitions when really he was imprisoning me. He made me believe that he was protecting me when really he was controlling me. He made me believe that he was helping me when really he was using me. I want the court to understand that financial abuse is a form of abuse. It is just as damaging as physical abuse. It leaves scars that do not show but that are very real." End quote. The judge sentenced Marcus to 12 years in federal prison. Marcus was led out of the courtroom by United States Marshals. He was taken to a federal facility. Rebecca never saw him again. While the criminal case was ongoing, the civil case was also progressing. Margaret Chen argued that based on the evidence that had come out during the criminal investigation, it was clear that Marcus had engaged in fraud. She argued that Rebecca was entitled to compensation for her labor. She argued that Rebecca was entitled to a portion of the company's assets because those assets had grown significantly as a result of Rebecca's work. Marcus's civil lawyers, facing the reality of the criminal conviction, decided to settle the case. They agreed to a settlement of $85 million. This was not 50% of the company. This was not full compensation for what Rebecca had lost. But it was recognition that Rebecca had created value and she deserved something in return. Rebecca received $85 million. She also received the right to remain as CEO of the company if she wanted to. But she did not want to. She had spent 20 years at that company. She had spent 20 years building it, and she realized that she did not love the company anymore. The company reminded her of James. The company reminded her of the years she had spent confused and manipulated. She resigned as CEO. The board hired an outside CEO to replace her. Rebecca used her settlement to start her own company. A company where she was the sole owner. A company where she made all the decisions. A company where she controlled everything. In the years after the trial, Rebecca became something of a public figure. Her story was covered by major media outlets. She was interviewed by journalists. She was asked to speak at business conferences about the importance of financial literacy and transparency. She wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about financial abuse in marriage. She started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women understand financial structures and protecting themselves from financial manipulation. The organization provided free consultations to women who were worried that they might be in situations similar to Rebecca's. The organization provided workshops on financial literacy. The organization advocated for legal reforms that would make it harder for people to hide assets through complex trust structures. Rebecca's book was published in 2022. It was called Hidden in Plain Sight: One Woman's Journey Through Financial Manipulation. The book spent 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It was adapted into a television movie. In the movie, Rebecca was played by an actress whose name I will not mention, but who gave a powerful performance. The movie was watched by millions of people. Thousands of women reached out to Rebecca to tell her that her story had made them realize they were in similar situations. Some of them were able to get out. Some of them were able to protect themselves. Some of them used Rebecca's story as evidence in their own legal proceedings against partners who had hidden assets. What became clear, as more and more information came out during the trial and the investigation, was that Marcus had planned this from the very beginning. He had not drifted into deception. He had not accidentally created a structure that turned into financial abuse. He had deliberately and intentionally built a trap. The evidence showed that when he had first proposed the trust structure to Rebecca, he had already been in communication with lawyers about how to set it up so that Rebecca could never gain control of the assets. He had asked the lawyers specifically, "How can I structure this so that my wife will think she owns something when she actually owns nothing?" He had wanted to create a situation where Rebecca would be motivated by the belief that she was building something, while in reality, he was the one building his own wealth on the backs of her labor. And he had been successful. For 20 years, it had worked. Rebecca had believed she was building her own fortune. She had believed she was independent. She had believed she was a self-made woman. And all the while, she had been dependent on him for everything. What makes Marcus's trap so remarkable and so horrifying is that it was not based on violence or threats. It was not based on physical abuse or isolation. It was based on legal documents and financial structures. It was based on exploitation of Rebecca's trust in him. It was based on the fact that Rebecca was educated and ambitious, and therefore the idea that she had become successful would not strike anyone as unusual. If Marcus had told Rebecca that she was not allowed to work, she would have rebelled. If Marcus had physically prevented her from leaving the house, she would have called the police. But by creating a situation where she appeared to be free while actually being controlled, he had trapped her in a way that was difficult for her to even recognize. This is what made the trap so effective. It was invisible. It was hidden behind legal language and financial structures. It was hidden in plain sight. Rebecca was celebrated as a CEO. She was celebrated as a successful woman. And no one looked under the surface to see that the entire structure was built to benefit Marcus, not her. Rebecca's case illuminates something important about how power operates in modern relationships. Power is not always obvious. It is not always violent. Sometimes power is exercised through legal structures. Sometimes power is exercised through information asymmetry. Sometimes power is exercised by deliberately keeping someone confused about their own situation. When Rebecca finally gained access to all of the documents and understood the structure, she was shocked. But she was not surprised. In retrospect, all the signs had been there. Marcus's constant need to control information. His insistence that he manage the finances. His resistance to Rebecca having independent legal advice about the trust structures, his anger when she questioned the documents. All of these things were red flags. But because they were wrapped in the language of love and protection, Rebecca had not recognized them as red flags. She had thought they were signs of a devoted husband who cared about her security. Rebecca's case is extreme, but it is not unique. There are many documented cases of women who have discovered late in their marriages or during divorce proceedings that they do not own what they thought they owned. There are cases where women have assumed they had ownership of family businesses, only to discover that the ownership was held in trusts controlled by their husbands. There are cases where women have been listed as the public face of a company while their husbands maintain control from behind the scenes. There are cases where women have discovered that property they thought was jointly owned was actually titled in the name of entities they knew nothing about. The pattern is always the same. A woman assumes she has ownership or control. A man structures things so that he maintains control while giving her the appearance of ownership. The woman discovers the truth too late and has to go through legal proceedings to get what she feels she is entitled to. Rebecca decided to use her settlement and her voice to try to change this pattern. She became an advocate for financial transparency in marriage. She argued that couples should be required to provide each other with clear documentation of all financial structures, all assets, all liabilities. She argued that it should be illegal for a spouse to set up complex financial structures without the full informed consent of the other spouse. She argued that women should be educated about financial literacy from a young age so that they are not dependent on spouses or partners to explain financial structures to them. Despite her success, despite her vindication, despite her settlement and her new company and her advocacy work, Rebecca carried the weight of what had happened to her. She had lost 20 years of her life. She had lost her marriage. She had lost her faith that she could trust the people closest to her. She had lost her sense of security. Even after she had won the legal battles, even after she had received her settlement, even after Marcus was in prison, Rebecca still struggled with the trauma of what had been done to her. She went to therapy. She worked through the pain. She eventually reached a place where she could talk about what had happened without breaking down. She eventually reached a place where she could see Marcus as a person who had his own demons, rather than as a monster. But she never stopped being angry about what had been stolen from her. She never stopped being sad about the years she had lost. She never stopped believing that she would have done things differently if she had known the truth. Rebecca's two children, Daniel and Margaret, were affected by what happened. Daniel was 16 years old when the trial began. Margaret was 13. They understood, at least partially, what their father had done. They understood that he had lied to their mother. They understood that he had committed crimes. They struggled with that knowledge. They had to come to terms with the fact that one of their parents was not who they thought he was. Both children ultimately decided to maintain a relationship with their father, despite what he had done. Rebecca did not prevent them from doing this. She understood that they needed to make their own decisions. But it was difficult for her to watch her children visit their father in prison. It was difficult for her to see them come home with mixed emotions about having seen him. Over time, the children came to understand that what their father had done was wrong. But they also came to understand that he was their father, and they loved him. It was complicated. It was messy. It was exactly the kind of situation that comes from family trauma. Richardson Industries, the company that Rebecca had spent 20 years building, went through a significant restructuring after Marcus's conviction and Rebecca's departure. The board of directors hired a new CEO. The new CEO was a woman named Patricia Williams. Patricia was an executive from outside the company. She had a reputation for running tight ships and implementing strong governance practices. One of Patricia's first actions was to dissolve the trust structures that Marcus had created. She worked with lawyers to convert all of the assets to direct ownership by the company. She made the company's financial structure completely transparent. She published detailed annual reports that explained exactly how the company's money was being spent. She implemented strict rules about transactions with family members. She implemented rules requiring full documentation of all contracts and consulting agreements. Within a few years, Richardson Industries became known as one of the most transparently run companies in the industry. Ironically, the company thrived under these new governance practices. The company's stock price increased. The company's employee retention improved. The company's reputation improved. The company became more profitable. The very transparency that Marcus had tried to hide became the company's competitive advantage. Marcus Mitchell began serving his 12-year sentence in federal prison in the spring of 2020. Federal prisons are different from state prisons. They are generally safer and better managed. Marcus was housed in a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania. He had a job in the prison kitchen. He took classes. He participated in the prison education program. By all accounts, he was a model prisoner. He did not cause trouble. He did not try to escape. He did not violate any prison rules. But he also did not show remorse. In letters that he wrote to his brother Michael, he expressed anger at the legal system. He expressed anger at Rebecca. He expressed anger at the prosecutors. He did not seem to understand that what he had done was wrong. From his perspective, he had simply been using legal structures to protect his family's assets. From his perspective, Rebecca had been ungrateful for the security he had provided. From his perspective, he was the victim. His conviction was an injustice. His imprisonment was an unfair punishment for things that many wealthy people do. This lack of remorse, this lack of understanding of the harm he had caused, was perhaps the saddest part of the story. Rebecca's case raised important questions about how the legal system treats financial abuse in marriage. For many years, when people thought about abuse in marriage, they thought about physical abuse. They thought about violence. But financial abuse is just as real and just as damaging. Financial abuse is when one spouse uses money or financial control to manipulate or control the other spouse. Financial abuse can include hiding assets. Financial abuse can include controlling access to money. Financial abuse can include creating debt in the other spouse's name. Financial abuse can include preventing the other spouse from working or controlling their earnings. Financial abuse can include using complex financial structures to maintain control after separation or divorce. Rebecca's case highlighted all of these forms of financial abuse, and it highlighted the fact that the legal system is not always equipped to recognize and address financial abuse effectively. Many judges and lawyers do not understand the psychological dynamics of financial abuse. Many judges and lawyers assume that if someone appears to be financially independent, then they cannot be experiencing financial abuse. But Rebecca's case showed that appearances can be deceiving. Rebecca appeared to be financially independent. She was making millions of dollars a year. She was the CEO of a major company. And yet she was completely financially dependent on her husband, because he controlled the legal structures that determined who actually owned the wealth. After the trial and the settlement, Rebecca dedicated herself to advocacy work around financial abuse and financial literacy. She started the Mitchell Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women understand and protect themselves from financial manipulation. The Mitchell Initiative provided free financial literacy classes to women. It provided free legal consultations to women who suspected they were in situations similar to Rebecca's. It provided support groups for women who had experienced financial abuse. It advocated for legal reforms at the state and federal level. Rebecca testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections against financial abuse in marriage. She worked with lawyers to develop model legislation that could be adopted by states to make it harder for spouses to hide assets through complex trust structures. She worked with financial advisors to develop best practices for transparency in family financial planning. She worked with therapists and counselors to develop better training in recognizing and addressing financial abuse. By the time Rebecca was 60 years old, the Mitchell Initiative had helped thousands of women. Many of these women had used the resources provided by the Mitchell Initiative to protect themselves from financial abuse. Many of these women had used the resources to successfully pursue legal claims against partners who had hidden assets. The impact of Rebecca's advocacy work was measurable and significant. In the years following the trial, Rebecca also grew as a person. She dealt with the trauma of what had happened to her. She came to understand that she was not to blame for not recognizing the trap. She came to understand that Marcus's behavior was his responsibility, not hers. She came to forgive herself for trusting him. She came to recognize that trusting people and being betrayed is not a weakness or a failure. It is part of being human. She came to build a new life that was authentically hers. She started a company called Mitchell Ventures, a venture capital firm that invested in companies founded by women. The firm was successful. It raised hundreds of millions of dollars. It invested in dozens of successful startups. Rebecca found satisfaction in using her experience and her knowledge to help other women build businesses. She found satisfaction in being part of something that was entirely hers, entirely under her control. She eventually married again. Her second husband was a man named David. David was a lawyer who specialized in family law. He understood what Rebecca had been through. He understood the trauma of financial abuse. He understood the importance of transparency and honesty in a relationship. They had a partnership based on mutual respect and full transparency about finances. Rebecca's children, over time, came to accept David. They came to see him as a positive presence in their mother's life. Rebecca often reflected on her life and how it had been shaped by what Marcus had done to her. She reflected on the fact that she had spent 20 years building a company that did not belong to her. She reflected on the fact that she had believed she was independent when she was actually completely dependent. She reflected on the fact that she had been controlled through legal documents rather than through violence. She reflected on the fact that she had been celebrated as a self-made woman when in reality she had been completely dependent on her husband's understanding of financial structures. When she reflected on all of this, Rebecca did not feel like a victim. She felt like a survivor. She felt like someone who had gone through something terrible and had come out the other side. She felt like someone who had learned hard lessons and who was using those lessons to help others. She came to see her experience not as a failure, but as part of her journey. She came to see the trial and the conviction of Marcus not as vindication, but as closure. She came to see her settlement not as compensation for what she had lost, but as resources that she could use to build something new. Rebecca's story sparked a broader conversation in America about financial abuse, about financial literacy, about the importance of transparency in marriage. There were news articles written about her case. There were podcasts dedicated to discussing her story. There were academic papers written about the legal implications of her case. There were documentaries made about her life. There were thin pieces written by financial experts about how people can protect themselves from financial manipulation. There were essays written by therapists about the psychological impacts of financial abuse. Rebecca's story became a cautionary tale, but it also became an inspiring story. It was cautionary because it showed how easily financial abuse can happen and how difficult it can be to recognize. It was inspiring because it showed how a woman who had been trapped and manipulated could ultimately escape and build a successful and meaningful life. Today, Rebecca Mitchell is 63 years old. She lives in Chicago with her husband, David. She has a thriving venture capital firm. She runs the Mitchell Initiative. She continues to speak and write about financial abuse and financial literacy. She is in contact with her adult children. She is proud of the work that she has done to help other women. She rarely thinks about Marcus. When she does not feel anger anymore. She feels sadness. She feels sadness for the man who had so much but who was so unhappy that he felt the need to control and manipulate the people closest to him. She feels sadness for the years that they spent together that were not genuine. She feels sadness for the marriage that was never real. But mostly, Rebecca has moved on. She has built a life that is authentically hers. She has built a life based on trust and transparency and mutual respect. She has built a life that matters, and in doing so, she has taken something that could have been a complete tragedy and transformed it into a story with meaning and purpose. When people ask Rebecca what she learned from her experience, she says the same thing every time. She says that transparency is not just good for business, transparency is good for life. When you know the truth about your situation, when you understand the structures that affect your life, when you have access to information and you understand that information, you have power. And power, true power, is not about control. True power is about freedom. And Rebecca Mitchell, after 20 years in a trap that was hidden in plain sight, finally had freedom. So as we look back on Rebecca's story, from beginning to end, what does it teach us? What can we learn from the fact that a woman who appeared to be completely successful was actually completely trapped? What can we learn from the fact that legal documents and financial structures can be weaponized? What can we learn from the fact that someone we love and trust can use that love and trust against us? I think the first lesson is that we need to be more aware of the financial structures that affect our lives. If you are in a marriage, you need to know where your money is. You need to know who owns what. You need to understand the documents you are signing. You need to ask questions, even if those questions seem uncomfortable. You need to insist on clarity and transparency. If your spouse or partner tells you that the financial structures are too complicated for you to understand, that is a red flag. That is exactly what Marcus told Rebecca. He said that the trust structures were too complicated for her to understand. He said that it was better if he managed them. That was a lie. If something affects your life and your financial security, you have the right to understand it. You have the right to ask questions. You have the right to insist on clarity. The second lesson is that we need to educate ourselves about financial literacy. We need to understand how trusts work. We need to understand how corporations are structured. We need to understand how to read a financial statement. We need to understand basic financial concepts. This is not difficult. It is not something that only people with business degrees can understand. This is something that any adult should be able to understand. And when we understand these things, we become much harder to manipulate. We become much harder to control. We become empowered. Rebecca did not understand financial structures. That was not her fault. She had focused on her career. She had trusted her husband. But when she finally learned about financial structures, she was able to understand what had been done to her, and she was able to fight back. You do not have to wait until you are in a situation like Rebecca's to learn these things. You can learn them now. You can read books about financial literacy. You can take online courses. You can talk to financial advisors. You can educate yourself. And that education will protect you. The third lesson is that we need to recognize that financial abuse is a real form of abuse. It is just as damaging as physical abuse. It is just as controlling. It is just as traumatic. We need to recognize the signs of financial abuse. We need to support people who are experiencing financial abuse. We need to create structures that make it harder for people to perpetrate financial abuse. We need to hold people accountable when they engage in financial abuse. Rebecca's experience is one of thousands of stories of financial abuse. Many of those stories do not make the news. Many of those stories do not go to trial. Many of those stories do not result in the abuser going to prison. But they are still stories of tremendous harm. They are still stories of people who have had their agency stolen from them. They are still stories that deserve to be told and that deserve to be listened to. The fourth lesson is that it is possible to recover from betrayal and trauma. Rebecca's life was not destroyed by what Marcus did to her. Her life was damaged, yes. Her trust was damaged. Her sense of security was damaged. But her life was not destroyed. She recovered. She went on to build something new and meaningful. She went on to help thousands of other people. She went on to have a good life. This is important for anyone who is experiencing financial abuse to understand. It is possible to get out. It is possible to recover. It is possible to go on to build a life that is good and meaningful and authentic. You are not trapped forever. There is a way out, and there are people who can help you find that way out. The fifth and final lesson is that transparency and honesty are not just nice things to have in a relationship. They are essential things to have in a relationship. A relationship without transparency is not really a relationship. It is a simulation of a relationship. It is a performance. It is a trap. A real relationship is one where both people know what is going on, where both people understand the structures that affect both of them, where both people are honest about their intentions and their feelings and their needs. If you are in a relationship where there is secrecy around money or finances or legal structures, that is a serious problem. That is a sign that something is wrong. That is a sign that you need to take action. That is a sign that you need to protect yourself. Rebecca did not protect herself early enough. By the time she realized what was happening, she was already caught in the trap. She had to fight her way out. You do not have to do that. You can protect yourself now. You can insist on transparency. You can insist on honesty. You can insist on clear communication about financial structures. And by doing so, you can prevent the kind of harm that happened to Rebecca. What is remarkable about Rebecca's story is that it is not unique. It is extreme in some ways. Not many people commit federal crimes to hide assets the way Marcus did, but the underlying pattern is not rare. There are many documented cases of spouses hiding assets through complex financial structures. There are many cases of spouses using financial structures to control other spouses. There are many cases where one spouse does not understand the financial situation that they are in. And in many of those cases, the spouse who does not understand the situation is a woman. This is not a coincidence. There is a history in this country of women being kept financially dependent on men. There is a history of women being excluded from financial decision-making. There is a history of women being taught that it is somehow unladylike or inappropriate to ask questions about money. These are systemic issues. They are cultural issues. And they need to be addressed at a systemic and cultural level. But they also need to be addressed at an individual level. Each of us can make the choice to be financially literate. Each of us can make the choice to demand transparency in our relationships. Each of us can make the choice to insist that we understand the financial structures that affect us. Each of us can make the choice to teach the young people in our lives about financial literacy. Each of us can make the choice to support people who are experiencing financial abuse. Each of us can make the choice to hold accountable people who engage in financial abuse. Rebecca made many of these choices. She chose to fight for what was right. She chose to speak her truth. She chose to help others. And because she made those choices, thousands of women have been helped. Thousands of women have protected themselves from financial abuse. Thousands of women have fought back against partners who tried to manipulate them. Rebecca's story matters. It matters because it is a true story. It matters because it teaches important lessons. It matters because it has inspired real change in people's lives. As we conclude Rebecca's story, I want to leave you with a question to think about. And I hope that you will leave your thoughts in the comments below. The question is this: are there financial structures in your own life that you do not fully understand? Are there financial decisions being made on your behalf that you are not fully aware of? Are there documents that you have signed without fully understanding what you were signing? Are there people in your life who are asking you to trust them without providing transparency? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then it is time for you to take action. It is time for you to ask questions. It is time for you to demand clarity. It is time for you to protect yourself. Do not wait until you are 50 years old and a lawyer is showing you documents that explain that you do not own anything. Act now. Ask questions now. Demand transparency now. Protect yourself now. Thank you for listening to Rebecca's story. If you found this story compelling, if you found it meaningful, if you found it helpful, please subscribe to this channel. Please hit the notification button so that you are alerted when we release new videos. Please share this video with people in your life who you think might benefit from hearing this story. Because stories like Rebecca's need to be told, and they need to be heard. They need to be heard by people who are in situations similar to Rebecca's, so that they know they are not alone and they know that there is a way out. They need to be heard by people who might be perpetrating financial abuse, so that they understand the impact of what they are doing. They need to be heard by the general public, so that we can shift our cultural understanding of what abuse is, and what financial security means, and what a healthy relationship looks like. I am grateful for your time and your attention, and I hope that Rebecca's story has given you something to think about. See you next